Hello, everybody, and welcome to Earth Optimism at the Folklife 2022 Festival. My name is Will Hansfield. I'm a transportation planner here in the District of Columbia, working for DDOT, the District Department of Transportation. And this is Planes, Trains, and Bikes, How We Get Around. Today, I'm joined by Chetan Jain, Director of Global Public Policy for United Airlines, Mariah C. Morales, Government Affairs and Corporate Communications at Amtrak, Jaime Ortiz Marino, architect and founder of Ciclovia, and Theo Rolf-Vandenbouwen, communication manager for Nestle USA. We're going to be talking about a lot of topics, but I want to start with a question about airports and air travel. National Airport, or DCA, is one of only a handful of airports in the United States where you can walk, bike, and take transit to the terminals. With an eye towards sustainability for all aspects of trips, what more can and should airports be doing to embrace multimodal transportation as part of air travel? We'll go to Chetan Jain for the response on that.
Thanks, Will, and hello, everybody, and thanks to the Smithsonian Festival for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. I think one of the first responses that comes to mind, Will, is the partnership between airlines and airports is really critical to identify more sustainable ways of getting to the airport. And we've got a great relationship at United with the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, which operates both national and also Dulles, where there's a metro line coming in shortly. And so we're very happy to be partners with them in creating more sustainable options for people to travel to the airport. So I think that partnership, that ongoing conversation about what is going to work for not only the journey to the airport, but also through the airport and how we can make that more sustainable. The other thing that I would mention is I think what's also really important is the master planning phase, is that when airports do their master plan, which is really a 20 to 30 year view out of what are the traffic patterns going to look like, what are passengers going to need, not only arriving at the airport, but also through the airport, and then revisiting that on a regular basis. Integrating sustainable transport options into that master plan is something that's really important. It's something that we encourage at United with our airport partners. And it's conversations that we have not only with national and Dulles airports, but also with airports at our other hubs like in San Francisco, Houston, Newark, Chicago, Denver. At all of those airports, as part of the master planning process, we look at how can we create more sustainable ways to travel to the airport. The exciting piece is that it's not just about transport options that we know today, like the metro, bikes, trains, etc., but it's also about modes that might exist in the future that don't exist today. For example, in February last year, United announced an investment in a company called Archer Aviation, which operates electric air taxis, which could in the future bring people to airports so that their journey starts from a carbon zero perspective right when they leave their house. So it's not only master planning in terms of existing modes, but also thinking about what are those future modes of transport that might exist tomorrow that we need to integrate in the airport, on the airport grounds. And the final thing I'll say, I think, as far as airports are concerned, is that we're also looking at ways of making the airport footprint more sustainable in terms of electrifying the ground transport vehicles. So all of the vehicles that you see on the tarmac when you're looking out the window waiting for your plane, the baggage vehicles, the fuel vehicles, the cargo servicing vehicles, the waste vehicles. So we're also working with airports on electrifying all of those fleets and incorporating infrastructure for sustainable aviation fuel, which I know we'll get into later. So those, I think, are a range of things that we're working with airports on creating ways for people to travel and begin their journey in a more sustainable way.
Well, thank you. And I was struck on a recent trip to Frankfurt that so much of the interior airport transportation and moving things was done by bicycle within the airport for staff and people just had different jobs throughout the airport. And the bicycle is a powerful transportation tool that has been maybe undervalued in urban areas. But one of the most exciting projects that I've become aware of in my professional career is Ciclovia. Ciclovia started in 1974 and has had a nearly 50-year track record of redefining roadways as open to the public for walking, cycling, performance, and more, rather than just as spaces for motor vehicles. with more than 900 cities modeling programs on this fundamental idea, including DC's own Open Streets initiative, I want to ask Jaime if he can explain in his own words what Ciclovia is, what its legacy is today, having had a 50-year track record, and where you see it going over the next 50 years. And I agree, 100 years of Ciclovia is a lot to cover in a few minutes, but take it away, Jaime.
Thank you, Will. I want to thank you also the Smithsonian and this group to be here that allowed me to speak about Ciclovia, as we said in Spanish. Ciclovia is the largest civic event in Bogota, Colombia. Could you believe that every Sunday and every holiday we have between 1.5 million to 2 million people outside on main streets, running bicycles, walking, and having a fantastic time using a public space in a different way. Ciclovia is a project that started in 1974 as a reaction to a process of urbanization in Colombia, which was by then being designed based on the image of the American city, which means based on the automobile. So in 1974 was really strange for everyone that someone had been educated in the United States will speak out for bicycles. I never saw a bicycle in the United States, but I really had while I was there, I was very fortunate to have two educations: the formal one in architectural school and the informal one on the streets. With the counterculture of the late 60s, I learned that things could happen, and I became somehow a radical and a very optimistic radical for the 70s that thought that we could help and we could introduce some ideas that could change the trends in urbanism and urban design. So we called on people that it's important for you to understand that we people from the tropics think, live, and act completely different. So we had bicycles throughout the 20th centuries being used in cities. So we had that as a base. We were also very important because we had the sport of cycling, a very main event in Colombia. So what we introduced was this idea of the space for cycling in cities. And having all that behind, we called up on people and we were successful to bring out on the streets 6,000 people and to convince the administrations that should be a process that should be defended. It's been 50 years now. In 50 years, things for bicycles have changed throughout the world. The debate on what should bicycles do throughout the world is right now a very important thing in the world debate, because after pandemic, many people are looking towards cycling, and bicycles have become a main event throughout cities in the world. It's not been easy for 50 years to sustain, and it's not going to be easy for the next 50 years to see where bicycles are going to be and what are we going to do. What is going to be the share of the cake on transportation in cities, and how are we going to accomplish that? I'm very worried right now that this has become a fight between the different means of transportation in cities. When we started, we decided that shouldn't be a fight. We accommodate. We started a debate with the rest of let's say with the automobile, with the motorcycles, and right now I think we all have to stop a bit in this big trend of fighting between different vehicles and try to figure out how we're going to share the space, how we're going to share the city, how are we going to share this future that definitely has to hold all of us. So I see, for the last question, I see bicycles in the future important. It's not going to be the same to talk about bicycles in Los Angeles, in California, or in Washington, D.C., as it is in Bogota. It's not going to be the same to talk about bicycles in Amsterdam and Copenhagen. Each environment and each territory has different circumstances. We trend to simplify the debate, and the debate is more complex than just having more infrastructure. We have to start thinking in social, in terms of economical, in terms of environmental differences. So bicycles are going to be something completely different. So-called the north, to us, the tropic center of that. And we are in the debate. I'm very happy to participate today in this between planes in the air, trains, and bicycles.
Thank you, Jaime. And having worked in Washington, D.C. for the past dozen years or so, one of the goals that we have is to, we are planning to share in the future with all modes, but it's the scales in our city and many U.S. cities very much, we're tilting away from automobile trips being the preponderance of all trips and trying to find a balance that's more heavily weighted towards transit, biking, and walking. So our goal right now is for 75% of trips to be transit, biking, and walking in the next 10 years, which we're at about 50% right now. So it is going to take some work to get there. And one thing that's really great is we have a fantastic train station in Washington, D.C., Union Station. Train stations in general are very well connected to multimodal transportation networks. And our station is a great example with bike trails, streetcars, bus lines, subway, and sidewalks taking hundreds of thousands of passengers daily to and from the station. And I wanted to ask a question to Mariah. What can rail do to get more people out of cars for all kinds of trips? Commute trips, recreational trips, long distance trips. To you, Mariah.
Well, thank you. And thanks for the question and for the opportunity to meet with all of you today. And thanks to the Smithsonian for ginning up, I think, what is a really exciting conversation. And I do think, kind of going back to what we were just talking about with this sort of sometimes sense that the modes are in competition with each other, I think that that is something that all of us that are trying to think about what are the best paths forward need to be very thoughtful about as we engage with communities and stakeholders, and I think as we design the city footprints that surround things like stations. I think sometimes we end up at odds with one another, mostly because we create an environment where it's sort of zero sum. A safe place for a bike feels uncomfortable to folks in cars, or maybe it's difficult for pedestrians to get in and out of access points. So I think that your point is well taken. We have to, as an industry and as a community, figure out how to make it easier for people to choose other modes of travel. And I think for us at Amtrak, we're in a really kind of exciting place to be part of how we're going to, I think, in the future, hopefully unify and make transfers between modes a little easier and clearer, and maybe reduce the challenges between getting from one mode to another within our stations. So Amtrak right now has over 500 cities in the country that are served by all sorts of different kinds of trains. And we have everything from simple platforms and PID screens. So folks walk up and they get a little public information from the display there that tells them the next train's coming. And those can be, very rural stops all across the country, to things like the Washington Union Station, where we have, subways and car share and ride share and bike share and trails adjacent, all of those elements. And I think what we're trying to do is, one, be really thoughtful around our stations about how to do a better job of one, making it easy for people to understand what their decisions are when they get to a station. I think this is true for going back to the first question, which is like, how do you make it easier for folks going in and out of airports to make better decisions? And I think it's many times similar for intercity rail, which is one, being a better partner with the folks coming in and out of our station, making sure that we give them a real sense of what mode options there are, looking at new technologies to figure out how to make sure that folks are empowered to make a decision sometimes at the last minute. Is it a taxi or is it a subway train? And I also think working better in and out of our stations and our hubs with other modes to make sure that good handoffs and trip times and places where there need to be meets are sort of carefully thought through. Because I think that also reduces a bit of the friction in helping folks, decide to use trains for both work or pleasure. And then I think the other exciting thing that's happening right now for intercity rail in the country, I think many of you might be aware that the country has just passed one of the biggest infrastructure bills in our history, and this is particularly, I think, an incredible moment for intercity rail in our country. The funds available to Amtrak directly will provide a lot of investment opportunities for things like improving stations and making them more accessible so that folks of all mobility needs are able to come in and out of our stations more safely and sort of frictionless. So I think that's a big step in the right direction for enabling people to make the choice to get out of their car. So our stations have better connectivity, they are more accessible, and we are, I think, trying to be even more and more thoughtful about how you make mobility choices just easier for the public to make. And that's going to be true for big stations like Washington, D.C., or a place like Denver Union Station, where we have a long distance train that comes through once a day, each direction. And yet it connects to one of the most thriving cities in the West, where you can get on light rail lines and streetcar lines, and bikeshare is there, and you're in a big downtown hub. And I really an incredible opportunity to kind of replicate that across the country. And then I think the third thing we're trying to do to really leverage these investments we already have as a country is look where there are opportunities to improve service. So in places in the West, Amtrak or intercity rail has really not changed much, or sometimes there's less service than there was even in 1950. So we're looking at opportunities to work with states to provide really relevant trip time competitive frequent service in places where maybe they have one train a day today, maybe they have none. And they are often in places where we have huge population growths. I would say Phoenix, Arizona is a great example of that. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the country, and there's no train that stops there today. So I think there's lots of opportunities for Amtrak to use our stations and partner with other modes, and frankly, to just improve service. And another kind of exciting moment in passenger rail, the arc of passenger rail in this country, is the funds available to states and Amtrak and others to really grow new service across the country. So it's very exciting. Lots that we can do.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And as a former resident of Denver and current car-free resident of Washington, D.C., sign me up for those train day trips, more one day, round trips in the day, outbound in the morning, inbound at night. Would love to do it. I also love to be able to fly, but of all forms of travel, flights are objectively the most difficult to decarbonize. What are the latest innovations in carbon-free air travel that we can look forward to seeing brought to market in the coming years? We're going to go to Theo for this one, and maybe Chetan at the end will have a few things to add as well from United standpoint. But to Theo.
Yeah, thank you. And first, let me say that I'm mapping out in my head. Over the past 24 hours, I've been on a bicycle. I took my daughter home from daycare. I've been in a ride share. I've been on a plane. I had some fun around DC on an electric scooter, and maybe I'll take the train to the airport to get back home. So multimodal transportation, definitely near and dear to my heart, something we all rely on. specifically to aviation, it is definitely a challenging industry to decarbonize, but there are really some promising and exciting solutions. I think already mentioned earlier is sustainable aviation fuel. That's one Neste is actively involved in. We've been pioneering that solution for several years now, and have been one of the first companies to bring commercial volumes of sustainable aviation fuel into the United States. And really, what makes it possible are the forerunners, the leaders in the aviation industry. So, Chaitan, United, thank you. You've been big advocates of sustainable aviation fuel. We're proud to be working with you. It's an amazing drop in solution. It works with existing airline engines, existing fuel infrastructure. An example is we at Neste, along with a number of partners, supplied sustainable aviation fuel from Louisiana up through all the states on the Colonial Pipeline system into New York. So the point is, anywhere fossil jet fuel goes, sustainable aviation fuel can go. There are still challenges on it. We need to scale it. We need to grow it, and that's a journey that certainly a number of players, policymakers, our industry peers, and everybody listening in can play a role on by indicating their own support and willingness to fly with a smaller carbon footprint. But as an immediate drop-in solution, as a way that we can keep our existing planes running practically overnight with significant emission reductions, it's a game changer. It's not a term I throw around lightly, but it is a radical revolution in the 100 years of how aircraft have been powered. And it's doing it in a way that significantly reduces carbon emissions from the aircraft, significantly reduces pollution all around, a good thing. And I'm excited to play my part to help get more sustainable aviation fuel into wings faster with United and with the many other airlines and airports across the United States. Huge potential for it, huge opportunity for us to enjoy the benefits of flying without having to feel guilty about it, without having to feel shame for it, with feeling positive that we're doing it in a sustainable way.
And Chaitan, if you want to join in and adding what United might be doing at this moment, I think a lot of people are very interested in this topic and would love to hear what the latest is.
Yeah, thanks very much, Will, and totally agree with everything that Theo has said, and I think Neste is a leading SAF producer, and we're very proud to partner with Neste. We just actually announced an agreement with Neste just a few weeks ago to uplift SAF out of Amsterdam. But I think, sustainable aviation fuel is such an important part of how you decarbonize aviation because you don't have to retrofit aircraft or engines or modify the engineering. As Theo said, it's a drop-in fuel, and what we're seeing is that it can cut carbon emissions by 80%. And as an airline, your fuel is really the greatest source of your emissions. It's the lion's share of your emissions compared to any other part of the operation. So that's really where we need to target, and SAF gets at that. The issue is one of supply. So if there's enough supply for the whole commercial air fleet to last for probably less than a week if all aircraft were to go on 100% SAF tomorrow. So the challenge is really how do you scale up that supply? And that's where I think the partnerships between airlines, between governments, airports, to incentivize and create that supply so that it's cost effective, it's available, and it's a viable alternative to the Jet A1 fuel that aircraft are using today. But it is really an exciting way of decarbonizing travel. Some of the other things that I think are being looked at to decarbonize travel are investments in electric engines. So that's also something that we're looking at. We've invested in a company called Zero Avia, which is making electric engines. Also looking at electric aircraft and what is the technology there to be able to power electric aircraft. I think realistically, electric aircraft will be sort of on the smaller side. So the 19-seater, express jets that you see today, I think the potential is to electrify those aircraft first, and then really focus on SAF for the lion's share of the fleet that remains, and also investing in new technologies in cooperation with folks from the energy industry and others about carbon capture solutions. How do you take carbon out of the air and use it to produce sustainable aviation fuel? So those are also really interesting technologies that we're looking at. I think we and other airlines as well have set a target of being net zero by 2050. the exciting thing is that the technology to do that doesn't exist yet today at scale. And so the challenge is over the next 20 to 30 years, what are the policy incentives? What is the technology? How can we invest in those ideas to get to decarbonized aviation?
Thank you so much. While we're talking about carbon, where people live is the strongest indication of how much carbon dioxide they're producing, with urban centers having the lowest overall carbon impact per capita and the outer suburbs or exurbs having the highest. So the question is, what mix of land use changes and transportation improvements should we be making now to ensure that more people can live a high quality but low carbon lifestyle? And I want to ask this to Mariah, and others can jump in after as well.
No, thanks for that question. And I actually think it dovetails pretty well off of the conversation about aviation, right? We're all looking, especially in modes where, maybe obviously we're pretty heavily fossil fuel reliant in aviation and in rail, for other alternatives kind of down the line. I mean, in the US, we're pretty lucky in the Northeast Corridor. We have inherited an electrified corridor. And so I think on the intercity, conversation, NEC being the busiest railroad in the Western Hemisphere, I think it's really a great first step to be kind of doubling down, investing and improving the infrastructure in the Northeast Corridor. That would be the area that runs between Washington and Boston. I think making investments like that are really important. But I think another thing that's notable, at least for us as we look at the world through our rail perspective, there's a lot that just moving and shifting the movement of stuff and people to rail, that really does a lot to reduce the carbon footprint of communities. Kind of a fun fact, I think total emissions from all the global rail sector from railroads are basically just slightly under what Texas emissions are when you look at the car emissions. So auto emissions in Texas actually exceed all rail emissions in the world. And that is even diesel-based and electric intercity, from freight to intercity. So I think just investing in more rail is a great first start, making it possible for more people around the country in more places to have a choice to take trains that take people to subways, and then to other kind of very low carbon modes like, bike share and walkability and those sorts of things. But I am not a land use expert, but I think a lot about it because obviously our stations sit on land and our tracks run through communities. So, I think there's a lot that we can be partners in as a railroad in particular, where we serve, as I said, about 500 cities plus in the country. So, when we sit down at the table and talk about what we should be doing as a country and as communities, I think we have to be thoughtful about, the policies that we come up with at the local level that promote density and that allow communities to still feel like the community that they are, but maybe encourage infill and other sorts of zoning changes that make it easier for people to live a little lighter footprint. And I think that has a direct correlation to the real value of big transportation investments like rail and subways and BRT, those sorts of things. I think dense communities have to become sort of thought as an attractive place to live. I've lived in very small towns. I lived in a small town in Alaska for a while, and there, is one main street. And what is wonderful about living there is, even though I did not have a car, I was living in rural Alaska, it was such a pleasant place to live and work and play because I could literally walk out of my house, go to a grocery store, go to entertainment. I could take a ferry to the next town. And I could really live low carbon. And I think you can do that in cities too. I think sometimes we underestimate how important it is to make it easy for people to be, coming and going from where they live to where they want to eat or shop. And those sorts of investments make a big difference, I think, in moving people toward a more low carbon lifestyle. Sometimes you're going to need a car for longer journeys, but sorry, go ahead, Will.
Oh, and I was going to say absolutely true about small towns. They don't have to be high carbon. They can be very dense and walkable, and still maintain that wonderful rural character. Jaime, I wanted to go to you because I know you had some thoughts on this topic as well.
Yes, in contrast, let me give you some figures of what Bogota is. Bogota moves 30% of its daily, almost 14 million daily trips, 36% by bus. We move 15% of daily trips by car, 7% on bicycles, 6% in motorcycles, walking 24%, and by taxi 5%, which is this is a city of 8 million with 2 million in the surroundings. So this is a mode, this is our circumstances are completely different. When I listen to Mariah talking about the Northeast corridor, we at the top of a mountain, 2,600 above sea level, isolated from everywhere. We have to move around 8 to 10 million people with this mode share. Well, we have become the most congested city in Latin America, and we are the fourth in the world in congestion, even though we only move 15% of our daily trips on cars. So this is to bring to the conversation that designing and urban planning is a completely different story throughout the world. And to face these problems, we have to reach many other alternatives. Maria, you must have noticed we don't have a rail system at all. So we have a lot of things to do in the future.
And one thing that DC is currently working on, and I get to work on personally, is we're several years into building a network of connected bikeways for all ages and abilities. And with every project, we get a growing number of cyclists choosing to ride for more trips. And that's, in fact, our goal, is to get more people willing and just choosing that as their first choice. And so this question to everybody, maybe Jaime can take it first, but what more should this country, the United States, do to embrace cycling as the low-cost, low-carbon, and most fun form of transportation that it is?
Well, I had the honor and the pleasure to advise Los Angeles in the creation of Ciclavia, the car city of the world.
Right.
And while I was there, I was thinking how this could change. And that's a big challenge in your world that is being designed and built thinking in the automobile. First thing I would say is this is not a fight. I said it before. We have to adjourn ourselves, and we have to join each other and see what part of the problem we want to solve. I think cycling is in the need, I think, right now, here and abroad, to understand what it can do in the future. It's not the only solution. It's not. I think we are being overstated. I think the future of cycling remains on how smart we are today on deciding what are we best for. We are not good for everything, but what are we best for should be the challenge of designers and urbanists right now.
Well, and speaking of innovations in transportation, e-bikes are a fairly new entrant into the transportation mix. And last year, e-bikes outsold electric cars by 10 to 1. And that ratio seems likely to grow. Should U.S. policy do more to subsidize e-bikes in the same way that it subsidized the purchase of electric cars? And I'm going to direct this to Theo. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's important to have a clear line of sight on what the goal is. Is the goal to have a low carbon sustainable transportation system, or is the goal to have an electrified transportation system? And those two things are not necessarily the same. So Neste's view is anything that displaces fossil fuels and helps alleviate emissions and pollutions from our current transportation system dependent on fossil fuels is a good thing. But when you look at the life cycle and you look at the cradle to grave approach and what it takes to make something, what takes to manage it throughout every stage, it has to still be a net positive. And right now, there are other ways to do that than just going all in on electrification. So, my view is policymakers, if they want to play in this space, should be looking at a simple equation: things that put a price on carbon, creating an even playing field for all low emission and zero emission solutions to compete with fossil fuels, and not picking favorites. Let the market, let the individuals, the consumers decide what they need based on their needs. I personally would probably get an electric bicycle, but I bicycle as a necessity, not as just an entertainment or fact thing. I can't drive. I've never driven a car. And it's weird to say that because I live in Houston, which is a very driving dependent city, but I make do, and I would probably go with an electric bike if I felt it was safe and affordable. It's again not for everybody. Cities like Houston will be different, and other cities will be different. Maybe the benefit for them is more public transportation, more buses that are lower emission than going all in on bicycles. But certainly they're part of the equation. They need to be there. They need to be part of an even playing field with everything that has a chance to help displace fossil fuels as fast as possible.
Let me ask, this is a sort of leading question, but for both Jathan and for Mariah, are there any issues with taking the batteries for e-bikes on your methods of transportation, right? Because they're pretty high energy compact batteries. So I know I can take my analog bicycle on a train or an airplane, but what are the issues with battery technology and coming onto aircraft and trains?
I can make a run at that to start if you'd like. So I love bikes and I love trains, and I actually like the combination quite a bit. At Amtrak, I might be kind of famous for sort of pushing forward some bike agendas along our network where it's possible. On board Amtrak trains, you can bring bikes with batteries. I think there may be, as the technology evolves, every now and then we run into a hiccup where it's some sort of new battery that folks need to look at a little bit longer. But overall, you can bring bikes on board Amtrak trains with batteries in them. I will say one of our greater challenges than really electric bikes on trains is there really is just at this point in the US not enough frequency and service and capacity to meet the need for the number of riders we have in most cities. So it becomes, unlike Europe where you have sometimes 30, 40, 50 frequencies of trains in certain locations, we end up prioritizing moving people. And then where we can, we move bikes. What I've been really excited about, and I am going to come back to electric bikes, is the opportunity for better partnerships with Amtrak and or Intercity Rail and bikeshare. Because I do think that if you can make it easier and clearer for folks to know that they can reliably go to a bikeshare station. For instance, I was just in New York this weekend and I took the boat over to Governor's Island, and I happened to know that there was bike share on Governor's Island, so I didn't even worry about like what I was going to do when I got there. And when I got to the station, they were not available that day, but I did see a couple of electric bikes that you could check out. So I do love electric bikes. I love them in bike share. I think that one of the things that they do is make that handoff and that opportunity to choose a different mode a little more equitable. Some folks are not really in a position where they can self-power a bike all the time. And so I love that bike share communities and bike share products are starting to sort of, grow more of their capacity to provide that as an alternative for all different mobility. Some, different people have different mobility needs to choose bikes. And sometimes it does not make a lot of sense to bring your own bike with you. But having those choices at our stations or in other connections for other modes, be it bus or boat, I think is a great one. So
that's a great way to think about it. More bike share and more ways to get bikes at train stations and maybe airports too. We have a bike share station we recently put in at DCA a couple years ago, but it's wonderful. You can bike share to the airport. Jathan, can you take an electric bike battery or a scooter battery on an aircraft today, or are there restrictions?
So there are restrictions. It depends on the battery. So lithium batteries are considered dangerous goods. So you cannot check those in the hold because of the potential for fire and other hazards. So what we ask passengers to do is if they do have lithium batteries to carry them with them on their person in the cabin. But it depends on how the battery technology is developing and what those batteries consist of.
Great. Well, thank you. I hope we get to a more consistent approach to all these different elements of the transportation mix. And I'm not sure if we have time for the last one I had, but it was about high-speed rail. And one thing that's true about the high-speed rail networks abroad is that they're a viable alternative to flights when the distance is usually under about 500 miles and the markets are served by both. The U.S. has really struggled to launch the network of high-speed routes we've been talking about really since around 2008 or even before that. And this is maybe a bigger question than we have time for, but just maybe Mariah, what more can we do to get high-speed rail operations off the ground in this country? And what are the things you see coming down the rails in the next few years that might lead us more in that direction?
No, I think it's a great question, and I think it's something that a lot of people don't fully understand. So I'll run through some quick stats, and then maybe that will at least get us ginned up for maybe a later conversation too. But one fun fact: so Amtrak between New York and DC carries 4 times the amount of riders as the airlines do today. So where there are places where we have high frequency trip time competitive service, you can actually take the pressure off of some of the really, I think, busy and congested airways that we have across the country. Another place where we've really made had an ability to be to serve in a higher speed sort of market where air or rail are the choice is out in Portland and Seattle. So you can do a lot with higher performance rail. The U.S. has about 140,000 rail miles in the country, and we think you can just do a lot more with that. It's actually the largest rail network in the world. So from our point of view, I think there are a lot of exciting high-speed rail projects on the horizon. Amtrak's Northeast Corridor is the only high-speed rail in the country right now, but I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. And it is kind of mind-boggling to understand why has Europe been, for instance, in a context that's so comparable to the U.S., able to do so much. And I think one of the things that we fail to understand is that, let's take the example of Germany. In Germany, they have a 21,000-mile route network. They have, hundreds of trains operating between lots of important, city pairs. And in fact, like if you looked at between Berlin and Hamburg and Houston and San Antonio, I know we have someone from Houston on the call. Between those 2 city pairs, Berlin to Hamburg, there's 60 daily trains, and there's 1 between Houston and San Antonio right now. And yet they are really basically similar profiles in population and density. Why is that the case? I think it kind of reflects the fact that first, we haven't over the last 50 plus years of Amtrak invested enough in just good corridor service, high frequency, service that Europe has done exceptionally well. So if you wander over Germany again, you'll see there's lots of daily trains. They're running, 100, 150 miles an hour. They've really focused on getting conventional rail up to speeds and to a quality that people are excited to choose. And then only 6%, so a really small portion of their city pair trips are over, sort of the high-speed rail threshold. And I do think that that's something where we're kind of nosing up to in the U.S. We think, sometimes that you've got to have just really fast trains between 2 city pairs, but you really have to have a full complement of good sort of conventional service and the high-speed rail trains to make all of that function in the way that it needs to, so that you can, really meet the demands. One of the things you need for high-speed trains is they got to go fast, they got to be straight, they're really expensive. You have to, let's see, I have the number. It's about $44 million per mile on average for high-speed train. And the average project in Europe takes over 15, 16 years from beginning to end just to get a segment done. So from our point of view, there's a ton we can do in the US with existing infrastructure, and then we should absolutely look at the right city pairs. I think California is a great example of that. If you could really take the pressure off of these key city pairs with good high-speed rail, and then feed that with conventional rail where you do make the sort of stops you need to make, or look in Texas, like there's a lot we could do with Texas Central or projects like that, and then a sort of a heartbeat of a really strong conventional service underneath. So you don't really have one without the other. You got to have them both.
That's a great and optimistic way to end our session here at Earth Optimism at Folklife 2022. Thank you to our panelists again for joining us and sharing your broad and deep knowledge on this subject. And thank you to the audience for joining us on this exciting session. There's a lot to be optimistic about in transportation. I'm thrilled to be able to work in this field. I hope you guys are too. But yeah, so much more to come. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. With my ciclovia.